doubly honored to be introducing Ken Dolan-Del tonight. Ken and I have known each other for over 10 years, and we met some years ago when we were both working in, we're both family therapists. Ken is eminently credentialed, has many degrees, and has been working for 20 years in this field. But the thing that sets Ken apart is the fact that he's involved with social justice. That many people go to therapy, and many therapists deal with what goes on between couples and families and individuals on an interior level with the psyche. And then there are people who take the leap and who link what's going on in the interior of people's lives and relationships to the larger social context and all the privileges and oppressions that are part of that social context and the intersections of all of those things. And so for many years, I was honored to work with Ken and a group of other therapists who were working with a social justice model to treat domestic violence and to really do work that is revolutionary, because we believed not only that men were treatable and should be treated, you know, as the parents of sons, we feel very strongly about this, that we're not going to ascribe to this essentialism that men are like this and women are like that. So it's really wonderful that we were all involved with this heady academic theory. And all of us who are seeing families in our offices every day longed for a translation of this theory that we could give people, that would be a map and a recipe, that would preserve the integrity of the theory while making it accessible to everyone. And Ken has done that. He really takes the issues around gender and power and race and class and sexual orientation and brings them home so that we can all have dialogue about it in a different way in our offices, in our families, and in the cultural discourse of our country. So I think it's really incredible that we're all here tonight to celebrate this work, this important work, and to celebrate this lovely friend of mine, Ken.
Well, that was so beautiful. I don't feel like I have to speak now. First of all, I want to thank Jackie and Jeffrey for the introduction. And I also want to just say a couple words about Bluestockings, which I just discovered a few weeks ago. I live over in Jersey, and when I learned that we were going to be doing this event, I took a trip over here to see what this place was like. And I found that it's an oasis of progressive thought. And looking at the shelves, you know, I saw Howard Zinn, I saw Alice Walker, I saw Naomi Klein, Bell Hooks, and it was just, I feel like I am among some of the most sacred books that are out there, and it's just a very special place to be. And I also want to thank Soft Skull Press, represented today by Ann Horowitz. Where are you, Ann? Ann's in the back. Ann is a woman who has been instrumental in getting much of the word out about this book and setting up these kinds of events, and I really appreciate that. And I also want to thank you all for being here, because I know this is a hard day to come anywhere given the weather. And I also know that it's the day before a holiday, and so that's a bit of a challenge as well. So thank you for being here. I want to talk with you as I get started just a little bit about myself, tell you kind of where I'm coming from, and to let you know that I started out in Rhode Island. I grew up in Rhode Island, was born in Providence, and I did my, after I was done with high school, I wanted to leave Rhode Island and see the bigger world. My father had arranged for all of us 3 sons to go to the University of Rhode Island, had put money aside for that. I was the third of 3 sons, and I decided that I wanted to go somewhere else. So my dad was, and my mom were both 7th grade teachers. Didn't make a lot of money. My dad managed money well, however, and he told me that he would give me what he would have given me to go to the University of Rhode Island, and I would then have to find the rest myself. And of course, going to Cornell University, I ended up paying student loans until I was like 35 years old. But I ended up going to Cornell University, and I wasn't sure if I wanted to be a veterinarian, because I love animals tremendously, or if I wanted to be a mental health professional. And so I ended up studying a program called biopsychology. And biopsychology sort of holds on to both of those areas of study. And in my psychology program, and later in my master's program, which was here in New York at the City University of New York, where I did my social work training, I studied the luminaries that all of us study when we are in that discipline. And so I studied Freud and his followers, who taught ideas like, in order to have a stab at gaining optimum mental health, one has to first possess a penis. And then from there, if you do have any sort of problem, if you have any kind of relationship challenge or anything that's difficult for you, undoubtedly your mother played some sort of nefarious role in that problem's development. I studied the work of Erik Erikson, who looked at white heterosexual men, and he summarized their stages of development, and he decided from there that that was the standard of normalcy that should be applied to everyone. No matter who you may be, what your ethnic background might be, what your gender might be. I studied the work of the family theorists who were prominent at that time, so talking about people like Gregory Bateson and Jay Haley. And these folks taught that if a woman was being battered and assaulted, undoubtedly she bore some responsibility for that. And most therapists are taught this same kind of curriculum. And what happens is when they're done, they take these ideas, which are full of bias, and they begin to apply them in their work. And all the while that they're doing that, they are telling themselves that what they're practicing is neutrality, is objectivity, is impartial. And I began to recover from this sort of frame of reference when I did my postgraduate training in family therapy, which took place at the Multicultural Family Institute in New Jersey. Am I losing this?
It's
okay.
aimed a little too high to this thing.
Okay. And there I was taught and mentored by people like Monica McGoldrick, Nydia Garcia Preto, Ria Almeida, a host of women, people of color, gay and lesbian, bisexual people who were out long before I was. And these folks taught me a much broader perspective. And what I learned is that it's important to center your focus on justice, on fairness, on respect, as the foundation for relational health. And that's really what this work is about. And what I want to also say is that people like me and Jackie and Sarah and others, Lynn, who practice in this way, we're often told, yeah, but you've got a political agenda. And it's very important for me to let you know that every therapist, in fact, every communicator, has a political agenda. The point is that we recognize that political agenda as being in existence when it differs largely from the norm, from the guiding political agenda of the day. So people like Dr. Phil and John Gray, the Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus guy, they don't have a political agenda, but we do. So we'll go forward from there. I wrote this book because, as Jackie so eloquently stated, I wanted to bring these kinds of ideas into an easy-to-read package that would be accessible to men and women who wanted to learn how to understand all the stuff that we've been taught about how to be a man and how it gets in the way of constructive relationships, and for women who wanted to know what to look for and find, I guess, the words sometimes for identifying what men are doing that's so challenging. And I open the book with a statement that I consider to be a hopeful observation. And that is, what if the measure of a man was his willingness to love? What a different world this would be, and what a difference we'd find within family and couple relationships. And that's my hope. And when I say making love, I'm not talking exclusively about sex, because sex is good. That's a part of it. But what I'm talking moreover about is all the ways that on a daily basis we demonstrate our affection, our care, our regard for the people who are closest to us. So I'm talking about things like just paying attention to the words that your partner says, just listening really carefully, learning about their world outside of your connection. So learning about the people that they work with, the people they spend their days with. Addressing your partner always, always with a consistent gentleness, a consistent, reliable safety. Those kinds of basic things. And also just the stuff like making sure that your home is taken care of if you share a home. Making sure that you check how the inventory is in the refrigerator and in the cupboards. And if you need stuff, making a list and going and get it and bringing it back. Doing things like doing the laundry. Taking care of pets if you have pets. Taking care of the other important people who are dependent in your world. Children, knowing your children's schedule. Knowing when their activities are going to be. If there's an elder who needs care, being a part of that. Those simple things. That's what I mean by making love. And what I think is that making love is something that men don't do very well, because instead of all of that, we're taught to play power. And I want to give you a very simple illustration of what I mean by playing power. And I want to show you this young man and ask you, and the surgical mask should be a little bit of a clue, ask you if anybody knows who this is. Anybody want to take a stab at it? Sarah?
No, I know, but other people not.
Okay.
Isn't he the guy who took off to get married in Europe even when he was quarantined?
Exactly. Yeah. This is Andrew Speaker. Andrew Speaker is a 31-year-old personal injury attorney who lives in Georgia. And in May of last year, he learned when he was having a routine physical that he had an untreatable strain of tuberculosis in his lung. And he was told, you can't travel until you have the treatment necessary to excise this from your body. But Andrew had a European vacation extravaganza planned. He was going to go meet his fiancée in Europe, travel to a number of different states in Europe, and get married in Greece. And he said, I'm doing it. He went to Greece. He and his fiancée flew on 7 different flights. They were in close quarters with about 1,000 other people during all of that. And when he was coming back, he was going to fly back from Rome into the United States. He learned that he was on a no-fly list. And if he tried to get on his scheduled flight, he was going to be detained in Italy. No problem. He gets a new flight out of Prague to Montreal, comes to Montreal, drives across the border, the United States border, with his wife now. And as he passes the border, his passport is scanned, and a pop-up comes up on the border guard screen, and it says, you got to detain this guy, you got to put on a mask yourself, and you got to call the authorities. This border guard looked at him and later said, he looked well, so I waved him through. Now this is a stunning example, I think, of entitlement. Because this is a guy who said, look, it's all about me. It's my agenda. It's my priority. I'm doing it. I want to tell you that I looked the blogs over. What were people saying about this? They were saying he's arrogant, he's narcissistic, he's selfish. I want to introduce this word entitlement because all those words are words of individual initiative. Entitlement is a broader problem. It's a group problem. And it gets more clear when you think about privilege. Because this guy knew that he was going to be okay. You think about what would have happened to a man who did the same thing who was a black man. What do you think would have happened? I think he would have been in jail. You think about what would have happened if a man tried to do the same thing and he was an Arab. I think that that bioterrorist would have been packed off to Guantanamo quicker than you can say extraordinary rendition. But no, none of that happened to this man. He got passed through, no charges were filed. He was even given the privilege of explaining his behavior on national TV. This picture comes from his interview with Diane Sawyer on ABC News. So I want to take this idea of entitlement and bring it into the more intimate context of relationships. And I'm going to read you a piece from the book. It's from chapter 2, which is titled The New Problem with No Name. It's a reference back to Betty Friedan's work. 40-something years ago, we're still dealing with the same stuff, unfortunately. And let me read this to you. Carolyn and George. Carolyn and George, an Irish-American couple who live in a working-class suburban neighborhood, or I should say Carolyn and George are an Irish-American couple who live in a working-class suburban neighborhood. Now, I describe things like the ethnicity, the class status of people in the examples because I want to make that specificity available so that you can, readers across the spectrum of diversity can identify with these examples. And I also do that so that stereotypes might be challenged some, perhaps dismantled a bit. George rarely changes his 9-month-old son's diaper, but when he does the deed, he can be counted on to forget and leave the dirty diaper on the changing table, the baby's dresser, or the windowsill, a gift for his wife Carolyn to discover, sometimes hours later. George has other perplexing habits, like doing only his own laundry, because I'm afraid I'll do something wrong and wreck someone else's clothes. This 34-year-old man who manages a large group of people in operating systems for a living seems to put aside many of his technical and administrative talents upon arriving home, as though passing through some unseen filter of consciousness at the front door. Carolyn, also 34 years old and a corporate communications manager, spent one recent Saturday at home with the couple's 3 sons, aged 16, 10, and 9 months. On this day, which found George at his job as a department store manager, Carolyn did the laundry, everybody's laundry, cleaned the house, made sure everybody was fed, got her middle son to his basketball game, and wallpapered a bathroom, all with her 9-month-old in tow. Now I have to tell you, these are real stories. They're changed a little bit, but I'm not making, you can't make this stuff up. On Monday, George's day off from work, he phoned Carolyn at her office at 1:00 p.m. asking her to come home. He needed to take a ride to his office in order to pick up his annual performance review paperwork so that he could get an early start on it. Carolyn, realizing that the 2 older boys were at school and only Justin, the baby, was with George, asked him what the problem was. It turned out that George felt like he shouldn't have to lug the baby with him on this errand, having put in enough baby time that day. He went on to say that his recent schedule, which had him taking days off during the week instead of on the weekends, was getting to be a real bummer because having the baby with him, he couldn't just unwind or hang out with his friends like he could on a Saturday or a Sunday. Carolyn, holding her tongue and counting 1, 2, 3, slowly to herself, tried to remember the last Saturday or Sunday she spent relaxing with friends. When she felt calm enough to refrain from screaming obscenities at George, she launched into a familiar challenge regarding the relative amounts of time and effort they each put into taking care of the baby. Let's see. Okay. So, an example of entitlement, playing power, as I was saying. You can expand that idea of entitlement and privilege really to the idea of patriarchy. That's really what we're talking about. And you know, patriarchy, I'm at Bluestockings, everybody knows what patriarchy is. Patriarchy is the system that puts men in charge of women in every institution that you can probably name. The family, traditionally, business institutions, educational institutions, healthcare institutions, political systems. Men make the rules, women follow the rules. Men set the standards and women meet them. Men have the authority, women have the responsibility. And if you take that pattern, it can be expanded by including any observable difference. So you expand that to include white people over people of color, able-bodied people over people with disabilities, straight people over queer people, people who look good over people who don't look so good. And we have a power of domination dynamic. And that constructs power equations, power imbalances in all of our relationships. And it affects everything. It affects who gets to define what's a problem, who gets to decide what we're going to do with our time within a couple relationship. But one of the things that I really want to focus on, because I think there's a lot of confusion about this, is the issue of communication. Because many people, including most therapists, believe that the conflicts that erupt within couple relationships are difficulties in communication. We're not understanding each other. We can't get through to each other. See, I don't see it that way. I think that it's more like somebody's got power, more power, somebody's got less, and that somebody with more power is going to be the judge of whether or not he's going to listen to what the other person says. That's really the dynamic. And I want to go through another case example with you. And this one is from chapter 5, which is titled A Closer Look at Power. And it comes from a time several years back when I was in my family therapy training. And so the setting is one in which a couple is being seen by a therapist in a consultation room, and then there's a one-way mirror between that room and the adjacent room. And in the adjacent room sits a supervisor, a team of supervisors actually, and a group of trainees. And the way this works is that the therapist in the room with the couple has a little microphone in her ear, and she's getting some communication from the team. The team's having a conversation, and they're feeding her some input as they go through. So the couple is Janice and Raul, and it's a white couple. And I want to also tell you that not everybody who behaves badly in the book is a white man. It's, you know, there's some other folks in here. And in fact, there's people of color. There's actually same-sex couples as well. So there's power dynamics in all couple relationships that sometimes kick up quite a bit of trouble. Early in my family therapy training, several trainees and I observed a therapy session from behind a one-way mirror. The clients were a white couple, Janice and Raul, in their early 40s, whose marriage was in crisis after Janice's discovery of the fact that her husband had made a major investment using joint funds without even discussing the matter with her. The couple now faced a financial crisis. After the discovery, Raul begged his wife's forgiveness. He said he wanted desperately to rebuild the marriage. As the session got underway, Janice stated unequivocally that she wanted Raul to move out of the couple's home for a period of at least 3 months. This, she said, would give her time to begin to grieve and reassess the marriage without the everyday pressures of the relationship. Janice said this was the only way she would consider a reconciliation, and if Raul didn't agree, she decided that she would need to leave the relationship. Raul seemed to have an impossible time making sense of what Janice was telling him. He repeatedly said, "But if we separate, then the marriage is over, so what's the difference?" Janice told the therapist, a young white woman, that she couldn't seem to make Raul understand that she absolutely needed some space to deal with her feelings about what he had done. "He isn't listening to me. He keeps saying that separating will mean the marriage is over because that's the way that he sees it. There's nothing I can do about the way he feels, but I want to be true to my own feelings as well. If he really loves me the way he says he does, then he'll get this clear and give me some space." It was becoming clear to those of us in the viewing room that neither the therapist nor Janice was making headway with Raul. Suddenly, a woman trainee remarked, "We should send a man in there. He'll listen to another man." Being the only one in the group, I was elected. I walked into the room. That's the way that happens. I walked into the room, sat down next to Raul, and said, "It seems, Raul, like the choice that will make Janice feel more comfortable right now is to plan a separation. You say you want to rebuild the marriage, so it seems reasonable for you to strongly consider what Janice needs. As Janice said, a separation will help her sort through how she feels and what she'd like to see happen next." Raul fixed his eyes on mine, and then he nodded his head into his hands and cried. After he regained his composure, I had a conversation with him about the importance of a man listening to the words his partner speaks and valuing them. I described how men typically decide to discount what their female partners have to say and how they feel, and challenged him to start paying as much attention to her words as he paid to mine. After I returned to the viewing room, the original therapist continued leading the session, and the couple began to negotiate the details of their separation. Now, I got to tell you, those of us who do this kind of work, we've seen this pattern over and over and over again. And at first it's surprising, and then it's just sort of the way it is. Unfortunate, but a very consistent pattern. I want to move forward and talk with you a little bit about abuse. I have a chapter in this book about relationship abuse, Gesundheit, which I think is different than most texts of this sort, because many therapists conceptualize reasonable relationships over here and abuse over here. and what I see instead, whoa, sorry about that. What I see instead is a continuum of misuse of power, at the most extreme end of which is abuse. And most people who have more power in a relationship, in some ways, edge towards and sometimes misuse their power. Some people do it consistently, and they want to control, and they want to dominate, and they want to limit the context of their partner, they want to isolate them. That's the extreme of domestic or dating violence. And what I'd like to suggest to you is that domestic violence is so prevalent in our society, it's such an epidemic, because much of the cultural messaging that we get all the time is quite supportive of it. And so I want to just show you one little example. And this is an example from Disney. It's a piece of the Disney cartoon, Beauty and the Beast. And if you have children or grandchildren, you probably own it or have seen it. And it tells the story of a young woman. I'm going to describe the story for you a little bit, then I'm going to show you a little piece of this clip, of the videotape. It tells the story of a young woman named Belle, who in the opening scene of the movie is walking through the village where she lives. And she is reading a book, and there's a lot of hustle and bustle around her. There are people doing their errands, there's people doing their shopping, there's people chatting with each other, and there's a lot of singing going on. And the singing is largely about the fact that Belle is an oddball. And the reason that she's an oddball is that the most spectacular example of masculinity in this town, his name is Gaston, he's this huge, muscular, very handsome hunter, very successful guy in this community. And he, as he says, has his sights set on Belle. And we see as the film as the scene progresses that he's stalking her. He's following her, he's kind of pushing people aside. He eventually jumps in front of her, blocks her way, takes the book out of her hand, throws it in the mud. And the people are all gathered around. They're continuing to talk. You know, are they talking about an assault that's in progress? And we got to save her from this guy. Somebody's got to do something. No, they're talking about what is wrong with this woman. Why doesn't she see that this guy is the best thing there is? Well, anyway, the next scene has Gaston having decided to marry Belle. And what he's done is he's assembled the whole community outside of her home. He's got all the townspeople there, he's got a band there, he's got a preacher, he's got a banquet there. The only thing he's got to do is go in and tell Belle that this is her lucky day because he's going to marry her. Watch how he does it. We can show the clip.
Gaston, what a pleasant surprise.
Isn't it, though? I'm just full of surprises. You know, Belle, there's not a girl in town who wouldn't love to be in your shoes. This is the day... This is the day your dreams come true.
What do you know about my dreams, Gaston?
Plenty. Here, picture this. A rustic hunting lodge, my latest kill roasting on the fire, and my little wife massaging my feet, while the little ones play on the floor with the dogs. We'll have 6 or 7.
Dogs?
No, Belle. Strapping boys like me.
Imagine that.
You know who that little wife will be?
Let me think.
You, Belle.
Gaston, I'm speechless. I really don't know what to say.
Say you'll marry me.
I'm very sorry, Gaston, but I just don't deserve you.
What?
I'm curious to know what you're clapping for. Well, you know, this clip, sometimes in training, we'll show it with the sound off, and we'll ask people, what's going on here? And I gotta tell you, the last thing they'll ever say is a marriage proposal. What they tend to say is breaking and entering, burglary, attempted rape, because that's what it looks like. And just to drive this home a little bit more, if you go forward in the film, it gets worse, because Belle becomes the captive of this massive, terrorizing beast, all alone in this castle deep in the woods. And her task, and the task is greatly romanticized, is to civilize him, is to turn him into the loving, gentle human being that we know lies inside. Now, I can tell you that I believe that that's a depiction of the story of domestic violence, that a woman all alone by herself is supposed to tame this monster and make him into the man he should be. I'm not telling you this story or using this clip because I want you to think, oh, these films of Disney, you know, they're filling kids' heads with these very patriarchal themes and we got to stop that. I'm instead showing you this because these themes are everywhere. They can't be avoided. What I suggest that we do is talk about them with our kids, ask them to look at them with critical consciousness. I'm borrowing that term, of course, from Paulo Freire, and help them to tease apart what's artful, what's fun, from what's destructive in terms of the messages we're teaching them about love and power. And I want to leave you with the idea that the power of domination doesn't have to be at the center of relationships. That what we are perhaps looking for is the power of love, not power over, power with. Power with is the power of shared understanding. It's valuing rather than ranking differences. It's collaborating rather than judging. And that's what I think is at the center of a love that's based on justice. And I'm going to stop there and leave you to discover what else the book has to offer, and to hope for you that you're going to strive for that kind of a love. Because I believe that each of us deserves nothing less than that. Thank you. And I'll be happy to respond to your questions, comments. Yes.
This way of thinking as neutrality, but in fact isn't.
Right.
Are you saying they truly believe that, or that's just what they're taught? Because are their feelings quite different from that? But this is what they're taught to, how to treat someone.
It's a great question, and I think that we're taught this kind of attitude toward relationships in so many ways with such consistency that it becomes like the air we breathe. We don't think about it. And so therapists do act this stuff out all the while. And for example, I have a chapter in the book called Beware Therapists and Other Helpers. Because a lot of what therapists do is very destructive. And so, for example, when a couple comes and they've got a problem, very often the therapist, without thinking about this at all, because it operates in that sort of just patterned habit kind of a way, they will expect the woman to talk more. They'll expect the woman to change more. They'll be happy with the simple fact of the man's presence and address him as though he's like a coach or like a co-therapist, rather than quite likely a large source of the difficulty, who needs to take responsibility for change. In many ways, behave as though he is the immovable object around which change has to occur so that things can go forward. And again, there's a number of examples in the book. Thank you. Mm-hmm.
What will an abuser need to do in order to really get this book? Or will he be able to?
That's a great question, too. No, I'm sorry. The question is, what would an abuser need to do to get this? My experience tells me that men who have a pattern of abuse need to be involved in a group process where they are going to be helped to take a look at exactly these patterns of entitlement and privilege. And they need to hear, as I talked about earlier, they need to hear from other men that there's a different way to live. They need to hear from other men what a different kind of love looks like. Because men who abuse are profoundly bound by the misconception that playing power is making love. That they need to tease that apart. They need to do it differently. Now, because there's so many messages that support abuse, they need that group context for a long time. Because they need to have what you might call a community of resistance. A group of men who are going to talk about how we need to screen the messages, because most men support each other who are abused. Most men support one another pretty unquestioningly. You know, men will see a very hostile exchange between his best friend and his best friend's partner. Very few men will challenge them on that. Will say, like, I don't like the way you treat her. Because much of masculinity, and there's a chapter in here about the rules of masculinity, much of masculinity is centered around men bonding at the expense of women. And so to break that alliance takes a lot of courage. And most men won't do it. But does that answer the question? Yeah. Okay.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I just had a comment, given, I just finished my master's in social work, and it seems like what you made such a strong distinction about is the difference between just listening and supporting people to hear each other and looking at power differentials.
Yeah.
And I guess my comment is, you need to get to schools and talk about relationships and power differentials, because that's a missing piece. Courses on ethnocultural issues that explores, differences, but it isn't talked about enough. Power, I don't even know that the word was raised in that course. I mean, maybe in a very small way, but this is much broader in terms of gender differences, and it's just a huge piece of the work.
And the question is, or the observation is, that while there's talk about differences, and there's a lot of emphasis on multiculturalism and on gender differences, there's almost no attention to the fact that all of those differences fit within a patriarchal frame that's hierarchical, that all those differences connect to power imbalance. And Joanne, who's a friend of mine, is saying that we need to get this word into the social work curriculum because this stuff is being taught today. And I share that observation and I share that concern because there's such a sort of, it's like a very surface kind of multiculturalism that pervades most school curriculums, most academic curriculums, certainly the corporate curriculums. Multiculturalism is let's get together and try each other's food and understand each other's way of dressing at holidays. Let's not get together and talk about how the fact that you're white means that every door is open to you. But if you're not, then there's many obstacles in your place with some consistency. The fact that you're straight is embraced. The fact that you might kiss your partner as your partner gets onto the bus could put you at risk for assault. You know, that might be another person's experience. So the power difference is, I mean, I share your concern.
Well, it's interesting because it's the core of the difference.
Mm-hmm.
Speak up about this need for this, it's going to
Yeah.
be women. You know what I mean? Men aren't going to be prompting this.
Yeah.
So, you know, that's part of my
And people of color and queer people always talk about this stuff, but they don't get listened to. And there's the dynamic again. It's not that the people without power don't know how to speak, don't know how to use. We all speak the same language. It's and the people who make the curriculum, who make the rules, are like, that's not important to me. Later for that, you know.
I'll do what I can.
Okay.
Talk to him while you.
I want to speak to the comment about men who are batterers and how they get a hold of this or how, and the only thing that I want to say is if you look at the way that we're dealing with men or treating men who we label as batterers is we put them into what's called anger management programs, which do not take into account any of the levels of hierarchy and oppression. So, I mean, and this discourse about anger management, like our kids know about it, and it's now like, oh, he's got an anger problem. So it's been reduced to just another emotion they have to manage instead of part of a larger structure of domination.
Jackie, you're getting me all angry. All agitated. Sorry. It's such an important point. We know from as far back as 1986, Gondorf and Russell studied anger management, and they said, not good. Anger management, as Jackie's talking about, teaches batterers that they need to, the way that he described it very concisely is, they need to become better terrorists. They need to bring it down just enough so that they're not going to get in trouble for their control. Because the way that anger management constructs the problem, as Jackie said, is that the problem is anger. The problem isn't anger. The problem is entitlement. That's the problem. The problem isn't that she does stuff that makes you angry. It's that you want to control her and you think she should do everything you want her to do, and when she doesn't do it, you get angry. That's more of the systemic analysis of what's happening. So anger management is generally a very bad idea, but look how it is promoted. It's in the schools, it's in court. Well, we need to send this guy for anger management. No, you don't. You don't need to send him for anger management. You need to get him to look at who does he think he is? And again, all that's going to only happen with a lot of resistance, a lot of support. Mm-hmm. Let me just go back. You want to say something?
If you object to my question, ignore it. And I'll preface it by saying the part of America that looks like me sometimes has a lot of doors open, and we need to have an epiphany, whether it's political or psychosocial or some other kind of epiphany, to realize we need some kind of radical social change. And you already spoke of finding that the, quote, classic theorists that you initially encountered in grad school somehow are subscribing to the status quo, which isn't enough, which isn't calling for social change. So I'm just curious about if you want to say anything about when and how you got your epiphany about the need for a change in sort of the psychosocial setup here. And if you want to ignore my question or throw it back to me, you're welcome to.
Question. I think that, to be very personal with you, I think that the fact that I had an issue of needing to come out as a gay man opened a window onto the meaning of oppression that most white men don't have. I think that also I was raised by parents who, they had the right ideas, but they didn't want anything to happen to their little boy. And so, for example, I was in college in 1978 when Jimmy Carter reinstated the draft. And my I thought, of course, I'm going to resist the draft. I started talking to a draft counselor, and I had my whole conscientious objector file, and I very casually said to my parents, this is really great. I'm working on resisting, I'm not going to sign up. And they went into this total hysteria. No, now's not the time to do that. This could ruin your life. All this stuff, because they wanted me to have progressive liberal ideas, but they didn't want me to be at risk at all. And so I think that's sort of where it happened for me, and I think that I got in touch with the right people. I got connected to people who really were willing to challenge me and other white men with the hope that we might wake up and try to become part of the solution instead of continuing to always be part of the problem. And I say that because I still do this crap all the time. I still use entitlement, I still exercise privilege, and I need the people around me who hold me accountable to try to keep going in a better direction. Does that answer your question? Yeah, okay. Lucille?
And I wanted to say that, every time I read your words, the part that holds me most of all is the principles of love, which is point country. Because I think so much, if this is something that we could learn, a lot of the other problems just would not exist to some extent. The question is, most of us don't learn love this way.
Right.
How do we teach it to our children? How do we help our clients to begin to understand what love really is?
Yeah.
Do you want to say something about that?
The first chapter of the book is my stab at that, to try to help people articulate what love is. It became clear to me when I started writing this book that people often bandy about this word, love, but they don't interrogate it. And yet, we all say that we want our most intimate relationships to be based on this word. And I said to myself, we've got to find a way to articulate it. Because if we're saying that we're basing our relationships on this term, it shouldn't be vague, it shouldn't be obscure, it should be an agreement. We should, if we're in a couple relationship, we should be able to articulate what love means and what it looks like. So that's my effort there. And what I suggest too is that I don't have the answers. I give you my ideas. You take them and amend them, add to them, delete some, change them, but there's a framework there for you. What does love mean to you as a man? What does love mean to you as a woman? What does love mean to you as a couple? And the action steps kind of help shape movement forward, hopefully. Mm-hmm.
Thanks for the book.
Wonderful talk. So I'm struggling with the idea of, you mentioned woman who set you up, your friend, about class, and how that plays into other partners from different economic classes that get together, or how that affects the way we communicate.
Well, class means many, many things. I mean, it means the amount of wealth we have, fundamentally. It means the connections that we have. It means the ways that we move through the world, where we're comfortable, where we're not, what kind of car we're comfortable being in and driving, what kind of social environment. And I think that if you are a person who has a class background that's pretty high, you do have a lot more power, and you probably have a lot more connections, and you probably have a lot more comfort in various places, in more places that have power connected to them. I'm not finding quite the right words. But I think that very much shapes what happens in relationships, because money is the root of all power in our society. I mean, I think money is the fundamental measure of power in our society. So to the extent that class is bound to money, it's fundamentally important. And then I think it's about negotiating the world and feeling like it belongs to you more or less. I'm not sure if that really answers, but it's a start, maybe.
I guess too, if you find yourself in
where your partner maybe came from a different background, different social economic class, and how do you negotiate that and
Yeah.
what you bring in and how that.
I think it's important to talk about it. You know, to put. It's a good idea to put what's covert, to make what's covert overt, because then it can be negotiated. Does anybody else want to add to that? Yeah.
That brings in privilege too.
Yeah, the extent of privilege you have, what kinds of privilege, how comfortable you feel exercising privilege. Sarah?
I mean, I'm just thinking about the part of power that has to do with the capacity to be unconscious or to deny. You know, the understanding of privilege as I don't need, I mean, it's not just I don't need to listen, but I don't need to know. And so the way that I think about it is that there's so many invitations in the places that we have privilege to not know about our privilege, to not notice that, you know, the ways that we move down the street or the ways that we make connections are in and of themselves different than people who don't have access in the same ways. So I think it's, and as you're saying, it's a constant invitation to go back to sleep.
Thanks, that's great. Mm-hmm.
To me, it's always sort of like for granted, you know, the ultimate entitlement. You don't really have to really consider what does it mean for me to hail a cab. You know, I can get a cab, not a problem. I'm not a person of color trying to get to Harlem, no big deal. You know what I mean? And you can just, it's the level at which you can take things for granted and feel safe in your environment.
It's all going to work out for me. I'm going to get what I asked for. It doesn't. It's not about one of these characteristics. You know, it's not about the color of my skin. It's not about my class background. It's probably not about something hostile and negative and potentially life-threatening. Thanks.
I haven't had a chance to read the book yet. Is it created in such a way that couples would go through it together and seed conversations throughout the book? Or?
I think it's the kind of thing that couples can go through together, talk about, and then work on the action steps, because there are steps for couples. Another thing that I push in this book is to open the boundary of the couple. So I do a lot of pushing of men to talk to other men about things like love, about entitlement, about creating justice and safety in their lives. And I think that that's vitally important, because that boundary, we need people around us to help us make these kinds of changes. And as I mentioned and described in a couple of the examples, men listen to each other more, and it's just a fact. And so I think that path is there. And actually I designed the flow of the chapters to be a progression that people could kind of move through and look at some of these matters together. Mm-hmm.
You said talking about two other men is a good idea, but I suggest possibly that it's, you know, some men may not be not your friend to talk to, because I come from a very blue collar background in the Midwest, and I have only a handful of friends male friends that I really wanted to talk about this issue, because the other ones would be just like, oh, don't worry about it, you know, it's very, you know, cheese and all those kind of things. So I assume you mean something that has to be something like you know, that would be somewhat enlightened, that they have to come from a healthy place themselves. That not every man is necessarily going to be a good resource to go to.
Yeah, it's a point that men often are just not willing or interested in talking with one another about these kinds of matters. We are certainly not usually practiced at it. Most men, in fact, have very few friends, male friends, that they will open up to at all. I mean, male relationships are usually built around activities, often around sporting events, those kinds of things. And as there's research that shows that as we go through the life cycle, we tend to get more and more isolated. We tend to get more and more connected to work, and that's really what takes the huge amount of space in our lives. So it's an enormous challenge, and one of my friends whose brothers read the book said, no way am I talking to another guy about this stuff. He's going to think I'm crazy, you know? Because also there's a prohibition among men, straight men in particular, about talking about much of substance, because if you get Gesundheit, if you get too close to another man, it might be funny. You know what I mean? So that's another one of the defining pieces of masculinities. We're nothing like women, and we aren't gay. Gesundheit. So that's a challenge for us. How do we love and support one another if we're heterosexual?
What kind of makes me think is like, where's the motivation for men to talk about it?
Right. Well,
When's it the power?
Where's the motivation for men to talk about it? It's kind of like the question, where's the motivation for white people to address racism? It's a challenge because men often will not understand that, in fact, this damages them as well. And we've heard Tim Wise talk about the damage of racism to white people. This is our problem. We construct it. There's a particular kind of loss that's involved with being the jailer as well as being the jailed. Now it's nowhere near relative in terms of in measure, but there's something to be gained through fairness. There's something to be gained, and I think it's intimacy that can be gained, a real knowing of the other person instead of a parallel existence. Mm-hmm.
Well, you gave here that the woman had been telling her husband, communicating something about the inequality of what was going on. He wasn't listening. He finally listened when she asked for a divorce.
Right.
And your point was the balance of power had shifted.
Yes.
And now he was prepared to listen. So that's when.
Well, that's a great, yeah. There's a chapter called "Is My Partner Listening Impaired?"
Right.
And as Lucille says, when people listen is when the other partner asserts power in a way that can no longer be ignored. So it often if you're a counselor, you have regularly had a couple come into your office, and the guy will say, "I don't know where this came from. It's like out of the blue. She said to me, I want a divorce." And she'll say, "What is he talking about? I've been telling him about this and this and this." And finally I quieted down. I started developing my own life. And I thought this was like a formality, because there's nothing going on between us. He wasn't paying attention. You know, he didn't notice somehow. And all of a sudden when she says, "I'm done with this. I've got my own life. I don't need you here pretending to be my friend, my partner," then all of a sudden he listens because he wants her there. And unfortunately, what you often see is he wants her there for reasons that are maybe not the best reasons. Maybe she services the home in some way, or but that's another story. But when the power balance shifts, that can be the thing that helps the dominant partner to realize, I'm about to lose, and maybe I'm losing more than I want to or I'm willing to.
I think that they hear all along. I think all of a sudden they just now become interested.
And they hear all along, but now they become interested. That's a great way of saying it.
Yeah.
They hear it. I mean, the ears work.
Yep.
It's going in somewhere.
Because it's all about the communication, like you said.
Yeah.
It's not that they don't hear. It has to do with respect.
Yeah.
And she's saying all along, like you said, she's not giving messages. She's telling him what it is she wants, but